Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing really well this morning. If you can hear me, let's just do a quick mic check and say hello in the chat box if you're here. I see there's about 5 people here waiting. Before we get started, we'll just talk a little tonight, and then the day before I had released some of the photo references. Hi Stella, welcome. So this coming week, we're going to talk about how to kind of push the boundaries of color using color theory. So in some ways, we're kind of revisiting week 1 and kind of looking at how we perceive flesh tones. Traditionally under like normal light, we've talked about a lot about how, environment, color of your light source, the undertones, all of these things affect the skin tone mixtures. However, as artists, we often want to break outside of that and, be a little more creative, let's just say, with our, design or our concept. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in the coming lessons. But for next week's project, we're going to work on one painting over the final 2 weeks of class. You guys are welcome to use the reference that I provided, or you can take your own if you want. You're welcome to do like a self-portrait. I know someone had mentioned they want to do a self-portrait. You can also, paint someone you know. This is an opportunity for you to do that. But I still encourage you to maybe attempt a color study, even if after the class is over, from some of the photo references that I provided this week, because we're really pushing our understanding of color. And I want you to cross-reference a lot of those pictures to some of the Asaro heads that I had provided in the very beginning. Remember the little mannequin type of head with the planes, where we had the color gel lights on the subject, because I think you'll see that correlation between the two. And if you watch the first lecture for the lesson that was released yesterday, you'll see that correlation. I show that between the photo reference that I'll be painting this week and the Asaro head that I had provided in the very beginning of the course. Let's see, I think that was pretty much it. So also, just for next week, I want you guys to really take your time with your first block in. I know we've been working at a really fast pace for the past couple of studies, but in the next 2 weeks, just remember you do have 2 weeks to work on the painting. So for next week's critique, if all you can do is like focus on the face, that's perfectly fine. Spend your time getting a good drawing down and the underpainting. I actually show an underpainting process that it's kind of like what we've been doing when we do the alla prima, but I let my underpainting dry for a day. So you might think about that as you're kind of timing out your project. But I don't want you to rush that initial block in, because the second pass that we do where we refine the painting a little bit further really shouldn't take nearly as long if you spend a good amount of time on your first color pass, meaning don't rush through it. So if all you can do is like concentrate on the face, that's perfectly fine. So I just want everyone to know that there's no need to feel like you have to paint it all in by next weekend, because I realize it's a lot of work and I want you guys to be happy with your project. So that being said, we can go ahead and jump in. Does anyone have any questions about that before we start? All right, I don't see any, so let's go ahead and jump in. Stella, we're going to start with you. All right, so I think everyone did a fantastic job. Dark skin tones, if you're not used to painting them, or if this was your first time trying to paint a darker skin model, it can kind of throw you for a loop if you're not used to it or you've never attempted it before. But I think everyone did a really nice job. So I just wanted to congratulate everyone on that. And I've noticed that you guys seem to be getting a little more comfortable with the process. I kind of knew that would happen. It looks like everyone's able to get a little more painting done, and we've loosened up a little bit, which is good, just because for these color studies, you know, it's a really great practice to just, you know, really try and work through the painting. Not really rough, and Jenny both said it's very, very challenging. So if you're not used to painting darker skin tones, or this is your first attempt at it, the hardest part is maintaining your value structure. Okay, and that's why I provided those little value studies in the download section from last week, because the value structure between their average skin tone, like the average value of their natural skin. So if like we had photographed her under like flat lighting, like with a flash, and you kind of ignored the highlights, that would be her like average skin tone. And it's the jump between that and like the highlight is going to be much greater than you have in like a medium or a fair skin tone. The forms jump much more quickly. And that of course also depends on how far or close the light source is to the model. So in this photo reference, which is different than the one I demonstrated, you can see that her highlights are a little bit more diffused than the photo reference I had painted, which the light source was sitting a little closer to her. She was facing the light, so it had a little more of a harsh like highlight and edge, whereas this one is a little bit more soft and diffused. And if you look at the photo reference here, she has those highlights right in here, but you can see that they have a little bit of a softer edge. However, her average skin tone, which is about here, you can also source it from here and here, or even right in here in the nose. You can see that color. So that's, I'm just going to do a little sample here to demonstrate to everyone. So if that's her average skin tone, right? And then we take the highlight color, which you can see it kind of goes a little more pink. Look at the value jump there. And if we had compared that to the value jump you saw in the medium or the fair skin tone model, those values would be much closer together. You know, on a fair skin model, her average skin tone might be something like, well, probably that's more like even a medium. So it would be much closer to the highlight color, something like that. So you could see that the contrast wouldn't be nearly as much. The trick with painting darker skin is to make sure you don't spread those highlights out too much, or else she'll start to look Caucasian. So you want to make sure that that average skin tone is dominant in the painting, which Stella, you did beautifully. I think you really did control your values here really nicely. So let's go ahead and jump in. I just wanted to demonstrate that to everyone. Okay, so we're going to just start off by taking a few color samples. Now, overall, my first impression is that you did capture her overall tonality. So she, you know, she has a lot of yellow undertone in her skin, but at the same time, she has some very red areas. So she can be kind of tricky. I noticed even just between the photographs I'd taken of this model, it really depended on where I moved the light source. And if I used like a warmer light source or a cooler light source on her, her skin kind of shifted around a little bit. And she even got, like in the photo reference I was using, she had a lot of violets, especially as the form turned towards that light. It turned more pink. But I would say she has a little more yellow undertone rather than red. So if you think back to that lecture on the darker, where I showed two examples of the darker skin tone, there was another model, and she was considerably darker than Kiara, but she had more of a like a really rich red undertone. So compared to her, Kiara has much more of a yellow undertone, if that makes sense. But so I think you really did capture that really well. I would say, now you can tell me, Stella, if the shadow color is not coming across in the photo of your painting. Right now it just looks like a very cold black, but that could be sinking in. So just let me know if that's the case. But I would say her shadow probably has a little bit less of a dark value. So if we take a look here, I'll just do it right here. So here we have the shadow value taken from the photo source. And yeah, I can't quite tell if it's it was brown. It's probably sunk in. Okay, well, I would take a look at it. I'm going to just kind of sample from, well, I can kind of see the right color up in here, but I would say maybe it's still on the dark side. You can see that the photo is kind of wanting to make it like a bluish gray, but if that's not accurate, it is brown. Okay, yeah, it's probably just the photo sinking in, and so that's something that happens with certain colors, especially when you get into the really dark colors. It has a tendency to do that. One thing that'll help is instead of using something like a burnt sienna, which has a tendency to sink in a lot, and so does alizarin crimson, try using like a transparent red oxide because it doesn't have a tendency to sink in as much. Another thing you can do is add a little bit. If you have like a color that you just noticed in your paintings sinks in all the time and it drives you crazy, try using a little bit of stand oil mixed in. So you just put like stand oil is really, really thick and syrupy. But if you put just a little drop of it into whatever colors tend to sink in, they won't sink in nearly as much. And sometimes it can prevent it from happening entirely. So yeah, and I sometimes when I'm needing a dark and I'm worried about it sinking in like that, the transparent oxide red with a little bit of ultramarine blue will give you that nice dark color. And you can always add, if you want, like some umbers. So a lot of artists avoid umbers. I don't paint with them in my upper layers with umbers, but I do use it in the underpainting because I want it to dry quickly. But it can cause some sinking in if you use it really heavily. It depends on the ground that you're using too. If you're painting on like an oil ground versus an acrylic gesso ground, then acrylic gesso is much more absorbent, has a tendency to sink in more. Whereas if you work on an oil-based ground on your canvas, or your panel, then it won't have a tendency to sink in as much. So those are things to all consider as you continue your practice and you start to find your own personal preference for materials that you use. I like panel. I like the firm surface. I like the smooth texture, but some people don't like it at all and they would rather use canvas, and that's perfectly fine. It just depends on what effects you want to achieve in your work. And then experiment with oil primed canvas versus acrylic primed. Some people prefer acrylic. So those are all things that we want to take into consideration as we start to refine and define how we want to paint. So I'll just say, I'm going to kind of take this color here. You can see that that's kind of on the lighter side. I'm going to just assume that yours is not that blue because it's just coming across that way. But what I would do, Stella, is oil that out and just take a look at it. It could be still a little bit on the dark side, especially when we get down into here. You can see like right along the edge of her skin right here, she gets a little bit lighter. There's a tiny bit of reflected light in there. And it gets darker as we kind of move in towards like the nose. So you can see that there's even a slight distinction. It does get a little cooler as it gets darker, or even in here in this eye socket, it gets a little bit more blue, whereas it takes on a little bit more of a red right along the edge of her skin right here. And that will help set it off against the black of her hair. That's going to just automatically add some luminosity to her skin. But I think moving over from there, you actually have really good values for her average skin tone and also her mid-tones. So just let's take a look here, like her transition tone out of that shadow is something around that. And yours seems very close. You might be a little bit more red. She has very warm shadows, so that halftone is going to be a little bit cooler before we get back into the warm color. So you can see that that's kind of more of the warm tone. So we have something on the cooler side in the transition, and then it jumps over to, let me grab a pen here. So this is that transition from the shadow. And then it jumps into, so it's kind of a cool, and then it goes into like a warm, and this was your color in that area. So yours is just a little bit more on the pink side, but not, if you just took this color and you added a little ultramarine blue, you'd probably end up with something close to it. The only other area I feel like I feel like the forehead looks really accurate, is this area down here got a little bit dark. Especially down in this form here, this area. You can see that she's also a little more yellow there, so that's more of her average skin tone right there, and we have yours is a little bit more in like a darker mid-tone range, and also a little bit more red. Looks like it's more like that. So, and you can see she does have that darkness in the hollow of her cheek, but then it gets lighter as it kind of moves up and down. So what I would suggest is maybe taking so this is the color that you have. So I would take this and add a little bit of yellow ochre and probably a little bit of white, and that will give you this color, which goes right here. Other than that, I think your colors look really nice. You could probably find some areas where you want to punch the saturation. Like, for example, in her lips, I would take advantage of how much more pink they are, especially in a few areas like here, where it really pops. Whereas yours looks, you know, you are getting slightly more pink, but maybe it's a little bit more on the muted side. It's a subtle difference, but I think if you go in, for example, if you wanted to go in and repaint or rework this in a second layer, you could even glaze the lips with a little bit of transparent pink. Like maybe I would do probably a little bit of alizarin with a little bit of transparent red oxide and do just a glaze over the lips and then paint the highlights back into that glaze. And that will enhance the lips a little bit and separate them a little bit further from the average skin tones. And I think you could probably pop her highlight just a little bit. So looking at her highlight color, it depends on where I pull it, because I feel like you did get bright enough in the nose, but maybe it just got blended in a little bit in the cheek. But I think she gets cooler and pinker in her highlights. So what I would do is just take the color that you have, and maybe even just adding white to it will do it, but if it feels like it's still too yellow, maybe a little bit of a cool pink like alizarin. And so that would give you that color for the highlight. So that would be, oops, make this a little less confusing. Hold on. So there's that one, and this is the lip color. So you just want to pump up that saturation. Let me look at other areas. I think maybe like this brow ridge got a little bit bright. So you want to watch when the forms are really rolling away from the light. It's very easy to punch them too bright, and you can see how it's making that area pop out almost more. It makes her brow ridge feel like it's really prominent. Whereas on her, she does have that shape. but it's still rolling away from the light. So it's actually going to take on a color more similar to what we have on the cheek here, if that makes sense. So just pay attention to some of those areas for your value control. And I think that's pretty much it. Do you have any specific questions? I think you did a beautiful job. Yeah, really nice work. Good job. And thanks for providing your palette here. That is actually very helpful. I noticed you mixed quite a few like violet colors in there too, and that's good because typically with dark skin, it's a kind of feels counterintuitive, but there are often a lot of violets because think about it like the complementary color to someone who has like a yellow undertone. The opposite of kind of a yellow orange on the color wheel is a violet, so oftentimes you will end up with some of that too. And I would say like her highlights kind of lean towards that. And she even has a bit of that right in here. It kind of depends too, because we have this purple background, and that could be because she's facing that. She's getting more of that violet here. But there's other areas in her skin where we almost sense like a greenish undertone because of that yellow, a green halftone because of the yellow undertone. So it's just a matter of, it doesn't, just because you think someone has a yellow undertone doesn't mean they're not going to have some of the cool colors in there as well. And I think that's why skin tones are so complex for everyone to figure out, because there's no one formula across the board for any one person's skin tone. These are all elements that we want to be aware of, so that way when you're looking, it kind of gives you the tools to be able to analyze what you're seeing or define what you're seeing, because otherwise we're just kind of shooting in the dark. So I hope that everyone's finding the little kind of breakdown that we've been doing in the class helpful, because you're going to encounter a model that has, a very unique skin tone, and you're going to need kind of a method to be able to figure out what your mixtures should be. But very, very nice job, Stella. All right, Kathy, I saw you in here earlier. Now, I had kind of adjusted some of your guys' photographs to try and get it as close, if they came in too warm or too cool or too bright. But if it's off, just let me know, just like we have been in the past. Kathy, is this looking pretty good to you? I think I might have brought your values down just a little bit because the photo felt a little overexposed. Looks good. Okay, perfect. Yeah, really nice job. All right, so let's just dive right in, unless you have any specific questions. So I think her average skin tone looks pretty good. You do definitely have that kind of warm yellow undertone. So let's start with the shadow, because I feel like your shadow is pretty close, especially if I take the color right in here. She has that very, very red undertone. You might be a little bit on the light side. That looks like maybe your reflected light color. And this looks sunk in, so it's hard for me to tell what color it actually is. But it seems like it should be darker. It seems like your painting would be darker in person than it's coming across here because of that sinking in. But overall, I think it reads pretty well. As you can see, it just needs to be maybe a little bit richer, but that could be the photograph coming across that way. What I would suggest, I feel like you have a good average kind of flesh tone for her. but I think she has maybe some cooler transition tones. So like when we get into like this range here, maybe going a little bit more of a cool pink, especially through the cheek here. Let's take like something like right here. So you can see yours is just a little bit richer in color. So this is your color. And this is the transition shadow edge. So to get here to here, it's really just a matter of desaturating the color a little bit. You're right in the right value range. It probably just needs to feel a little less hot. So I would probably add a little bit of ultramarine blue and then white to bring it back to the right value. But it's really, really close. And I think the same thing goes on this left side. Her highlights do have a tendency to go more pink, pink and violet, which is surprising because she has so much warmth, but that's partly because of the direction and how she's facing the light. But if we look at that highlight color, kind of right in the middle of that cheek, you find the right value. You might be able to go a little brighter as well, but you can see how yours has more of a yellow influence. So it would be a matter of, if you wanted to go in and correct that, it would be a matter of going in with a fresh color. I don't know if you would really take something this yellow. You probably could adjust it, but it would definitely need like alizarin and white. But you could even just start with a fresh color for something like that. And part of the reason for this is because I had photographed her under a cool light source. So I'm going to take that same color for like the brighter highlight here in her forehead. So you can see it's an even lighter and cooler value, and that's something to keep an eye on as well, is that her highlight in her forehead is significantly brighter significantly brighter. So even between here and here, you can see it's like the same color, but it's much more white in the mixture. And yours look very similar. That could be due to blending. It could also be that just that you didn't maybe push that value quite enough. And by pushing that value, you're going to get more kind of richness out of some of her average skin tone, which I actually think you got really well. She might be a little bit on the yellow side, but that could just be the photograph. And I feel like in some areas, like up here in the forehead, you really nailed it. That looks really, really good. Great color in the lips. I like that you introduced that violet in the lips. That looks really, really nice. And that rich kind of red tone. Though that could probably be a cooler color. Oops, let me grab my... So I feel like you do have those beautiful colors in the upper lip. That one, maybe it's a little on the rich side. I think it's just a cooler pink. It does go more saturated. But even if you just took that color and added a little white to it, the existing color that you used, just add white, you would end up with something like that. Yes, I did. Rosalie, to answer your question, did I photograph all 3 models under the cool light? Yes. So the light I use is the one I paint under as well. It's that LED light. And it has kind of a Kelvin rating, so I can make the light really warm or I can make it really cool. And I have it set as close to north-facing light as possible. So I think I have it set at like 5,300 Kelvin, and natural north-facing light is 6,000 Kelvin. So when we're talking about, and I actually have north facing windows in my studio that I usually have open when I'm painting, but it makes it a little hard when I'm filming because of glare, because the windows are quite large and broad. But when I do have the opportunity to use the north light, it kind of helps to balance it out. But the LED does a pretty good job at mimicking that north light for painting under. And it's, if you're wanting to capture someone's kind of natural skin tone, then that's the type of lighting you want to use. It's not excessively blue, but it's just a little bit on the cooler side. If you don't have an LED light, you can get CFL bulbs, you know, like the spiral light bulbs, and you can buy them, I think, close to 5,000 Kelvin, just straight out of the hardware store. So you'd want to go with like the bluer one, and those work really nicely for setting up still life or even lighting your own models in the studio. Okay, so coming back to this, yeah, I think you have a pretty good sense of this average skin tone, but you'll notice like some areas like here on that upper lip where that plane starts to turn away, we could go a little bit cooler. Sorry, let me grab the right brush here. And I think it's just a matter of balancing out some of that yellow. So I'll do a little paint over here to show you what some of that would look like. I think most significantly, it's probably going to be those cool highlights. So let me start with some of that. So what would happen if we cooled off some of these highlights and also added a little more contrast around those highlights? Maybe introduced a little more pink in a few select areas. Usually you'd find that on that far left side, she gets a little bit cooler. And then in that lower cheek, a little bit cooler. That highlight on her nose. So if you just hit those highlight areas with a cooler color, it'll start to kind of complement all that yellow that you have in her skin. You could even go with like a deeper rosy color, like right in here around this highlight. And then notice how purple she gets. It's kind of like a purple gray. It really reflects that background. So if we went in, I feel like you have something on the cooler side, but if you pushed maybe the temperature a little bit closer to what you have in the lips, and she has that same thing happening, but it's a little bit lighter up in here. You know, when I was painting this piece too, I was actually surprised at how much violet there was on this far side in the skin tones, because it was so warm on the left side. And looking back at the painting, I would probably go in and try and balance some of that out a little bit, so that I would introduce a few more kind of yellow tones in my painting on this side. Because she does have that like average skin tone in a few areas, like you can see hints of it pop up here and there. But you can see how that actually complements her her warm skin tone. And it's just one of those things that we often don't think about when we're putting in highlights, but a lot of people don't realize, and it's hard to see sometimes, but if you think about your light source, it'll help kind of inform what you're going to make that highlight color. And one of the ways to get, so a lot of times when people paint dark skin tones, they're like, well, why doesn't the skin tone glow the same way because it's a darker value. So how do you feel? You make it feel like they're kind of emitting light or glowing. It all comes down to the temperature shift in that highlight. And you're afraid to go so light. You know, it's okay to go really bright on a highlight because, okay, so if you think about it, the highlight on any skin tone or on any surface is a direct reflection of the light source. It's literally the light hitting the surface and reflecting off and creating a shimmer, right? So it's going to be nearly equally as bright as the light source. So even on someone with a darker skin tone, those highlight colors are going to be pretty close to the same value. There will be a slight difference, but where the bigger difference happens is right in here, where that highlight is no longer shimmering and we are seeing their average skin tone. That jump between here and here is what makes them feel like she has a darker skin tone. And just that overall tonality, which you captured. You didn't spread your highlights out too far. She does feel like she's in the right tonality. So it's just a matter of introducing some of those cool tones to complement the warm tones. And that's what makes her feel like she's glowing a little bit. It's not just the value shift, but it's that color shift in the highlight. Does that make sense? So when I'm painting, even when I'm painting someone who's lighter skin, and I think, you know, you've probably seen me do this before, but right around the highlight, I'll introduce a couple of colors. Usually, like I'll have a cool and then a warm kind of adjacent to each other. And the reason I do that is to get those colors to kind of vibrate off each other so that they feel like they're glowing. It's an optical effect because our eyes kind of take those two colors and blend them without actually you having to blend them together. And you can do the same thing. Actually, the same thing is happening here. We have this yellow right next to like this cooler pink, and then we have an even cooler pink. So it's kind of creating that same vibration effect. And you could even, if you wanted to, you know, be more interpretive with your color, you could even take something of the same value as that highlight. See if I can find the right value. And you could use that a little bit too. If you wanted to just get the color to vibrate a little bit more, you could have the pink right next to a blue. In fact, I see a little bit of that blue shimmer happening in here in her inner corner. If we look there, you can see it goes kind of bluish right on this inner corner. So you could introduce some of that blue there and just kind of spot it around near the highlight areas, and you're going to get that same kind of shimmer effect. And it can be really nice. And it depends. Some dark skin tones, their highlight looks really, really blue. It really depends on how dark they are, and also, you know, the light source, of course. The darker the skin, the more reflective in a way. The highlight is going to jump off the skin much more quickly, and it's going to feel a little bit more sharp in contrast to their average skin tone. So that's something to pay attention to as well. You did a beautiful job though. I think other areas maybe you could introduce some more cool would be here in her eyelids. She has a little more purple, kind of a cooler, subdued color in there, so you could introduce, you have it on the left eye. I think this right one just could use a little bit of that cooling off, and then maybe more of like this color in here as it turns, so that it turns more gradually. But other than that, I think you did a really nice job. Do you have any questions? Oh, you're very welcome. You know, just to bring this up, a lot of people don't realize that the skin in this area is very, very blue on almost everyone. It goes kind of blue. You might see a lot more purple. It might be more of a blue-green. it really depends on that person's undertone, and kind of, we get different colors kind of around our eyelids. But the skin gets so delicate and thin right through here and right through here, that we typically do end up with some cooler tones before they get more red or pink, like right in here where you get the fold, or even on the inner rim, we get more of a pink. But on these inner corners, the skin gets really thin and we start to see more of like the veins and stuff underneath. And so that's something to pay attention to, because it's an opportunity for us to kind of vary up the color and create some interest in the painting. The same thing always happens around here. We always get like a little bit of a cooler tone around the muzzle, and so that's another opportunity for, you know, changing up our color. So those are areas kind of to look for, those cool tones. Another area you'll typically see it is right here in this transition out of the bridge of the nose. You'll end up with usually a few cooler tones. But other than that, you know, when you know where to kind of look for these things, you start to see them. You know, we don't know that they're there until they're usually pointed out to us, and then you're like, oh, now I see it. Yeah, but other than that, beautiful job. All right. So Angela, are you in here? All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Let me know if you are here, if the colors need adjusting. So let's go ahead and start with those shadows. I think you have a pretty close, oops, let me grab the right brush here. So that's your shadow, and then hers is probably just a little bit darker and more red. That's going to add a little more contrast. Oh, there you are. So let me know if the picture looks a little bit light. I tried to adjust everyone's last night to get it a little bit closer, but let me know if you want me to tweak it a little bit beforehand. So yeah, that shadow could probably use a little bit more. I would just say maybe add some transparent oxide red and some blue. So I'll just say transparent oxide plus ultramarine blue. That's going to give you that darker, richer color. You could probably even just glaze that over the shadow, and that would deepen it and provide a little bit more contrast to that shadow. So let's go ahead and take a sample of that average skin tone. So in this picture, it is a little tricky to find her average skin tone because this side is so light. She's turning towards that light, but I would say it's somewhere in here. Like in this cheek, even though it's going to be a little bit more pink in that cheek area. I'm going to change that gray, make it a little bit darker. That's a little harder to see. Okay, there we go. So that's her kind of average skin tone, and I'm going to take the color from here. Looks like you're really, really close. Yours might just be a little bit more of a warm, saturated color. She has a little bit more of kind of a soft pink to that color. So what I would suggest for that one is maybe just a little bit, a touch of burnt sienna would probably do it. Burnt sienna. It's going to take out some of that yellow. And if it still feels too rich, you can always add a little ultramarine blue. But yeah, it's really, really close. So I don't know if just the burnt sienna would do it enough. Just make sure you keep the values really close. I think you can go just a touch darker, but that should do it. So let's look at the highlight color. looks like you kind of have two different ones happening, so I'm going to take the one from the forehead here. Now she has like kind of two, you have like the really sparkle, you know, the reflection or the specular highlight here, and then you have it like where it's more diffused. There's a slight value difference there. Yours is probably just a little bit more on the yellow side, so I think if you push that a little bit cooler, it would probably work. Where I feel the biggest change is right in here, where we can actually introduce more of her average skin tone, maybe just slightly lighter. So if we take that color there that we see in the cheek on the left side, yours is just a little bit pale. Okay, so I think if you went in and introduced a little bit, almost taking this color but plus white, so that way, and this is, so I'm going to mark this left cheek. Let me mark these out for you real quick before I forget. This is shadow, highlight. So if we introduced a little bit more of this color into that side, it would actually help it feel a little bit more like her average skin tone. So let me go ahead and do that. I think you have some nice pinks in the lips, maybe a little bit on the bright side here. It goes a little bit more, you can see, in a darker kind of mauve tone. Let me just take two more samples for that area. The lips are always surprisingly dark in value on most people because we have more color there. So you can see you can go a little bit deeper and more rosy with the lips there. I'll mark that out for you as well. So you want to go from here to here. I would say you could probably just add, you need almost like a warmer red. So maybe a little bit of some red oxide. It's going to kind of bring it a little bit more towards the orange. Actually, I take that back. Don't use red oxide. Use a little bit of cad red and blue. And that will give you something a little bit deeper and more rosy. I was thinking red oxide at first, but I think that would go too orange. We want to keep it in that slightly cooler red. So let me just do a quick paint over. Do you have any questions in the meantime? So I'm going to start with that shadow and just bring that a little bit darker, just a touch. So I think if you just glazed it, you'd probably end up with enough contrast, and that's going to also pull up into the forehead as that rounds just a little bit more. It's going to be a little bit more intense down in here. You can already see that's adding some more richness to that halftone. You might even need to push that halftone a little bit darker, just right through there. Let me make that a little bit smaller. Right next to that shadow edge. And then going into, I think the biggest change that's going to help is that left cheek. And again, like I mentioned earlier, looking back at my painting, I'd probably go back in and introduce a few more of her average skin tone colors on that left side just to balance it out myself, just looking back at it. But one area that you can see more of it is right in here. And then down in here, it gets a little darker right on that edge where it meets the background. And it pulls in and around those highlights just a little more so it doesn't get so washed out. And it even gets a little bit darker as it moves down the form here. Because if you think about the shape that's happening right here, this plane is facing up, and then this plane is starting to face down, and so as that rounds down this way, it's going to gradually get darker. We're going to have that fall off of light. So down in here it gets even darker. You have a really nice color in here. I think that's pretty good. Maybe could go a little cooler, more towards that kind of purpley color up in here. And then those highlights, I think if you just went less yellow, maybe more towards a pink, a cool pink for some of those areas, it would help to kind of complement that color. She almost has like a peachy tone right next to it that helps it kind of vibrate. So if you look, you have like that cooler pink highlight and then kind of a peachy tone before it goes a little bit darker. And you might find yourself wanting to introduce some of those colors just a little bit into the nose on this left side, maybe a little bit of pink. Not that we want to make it too much lighter, but just find a few areas where you could kind of pump up the red in the nose. And maybe a little bit more halftone before it turns to shadow. It's going to get that form to round out. And then with the lip, it would just be a matter of right where that, below that highlight is where that plane changes on her lip. So making that a little bit on the darker side. And then it picks up like a real rich burgundy right before it turns into that shadow. So just thinking about how to break that up with tiles. And her upper lip could probably just overall be a little bit on the darker side to get it to round down. She really has a lot of violet, darker violets in here. And that's going to really accentuate that. Typically, even with somebody who has very full lips, and even though she does have like this highlight here towards the top where it's like the most full, the upper lip is like an underplane and the bottom lip usually sticks out and catches the light a little bit more. So just remember that whenever you're going in and painting lips, no matter what, that top lip is somewhat of an underplane. It is turning under, just like the eye sockets turn under. They recess a little bit, and then that bottom lip sticks out. Let's see. I think in that forehead it would be the same thing. You could probably push the value a little bit in that highlight, especially because it's that forehead highlight. It gets a little bit more intense than the other highlights, but maybe you can go a little bit darker next to the highlight. Maybe push in a little bit more with that darker value, and that's going to help get it to glow a little bit more. And it doesn't get so spread out. Does that make sense? I'm not going to address the chest area because I'm just kind of concentrating on the face, but you obviously go through in some of these areas. Like here, she gets kind of more of that purple. You could go in and, you know, add those to those areas. But I told everyone to concentrate on the face. But if you decided to go back in and make some of these adjustments to the face, you would obviously carry some of those down through the chest. Yeah, beautiful job though. Everyone did really well with keeping her, you know, looking like she's darker skin. I think the main adjustment would be mostly on that left side, if you decided to go back in and revisit this piece. Yeah, let me know if you have any follow-up questions. All right, Susan, are you here? I'll take a sip of water, guys. Just give me 1 second. So, Susan, I know you had sent me, I'm not sure if you're here live right now, but just say hello if you are. But I know you'd sent me, oh, there you are. So you'd sent me 2 different photos. So there was this one, and then there was this one. And I decided to go with this one because this one feels a little bit hot and orange compared to this one, which feels like it's probably something you painted more in that realm. And I also kind of tweaked this one a little bit in the program to make sure I was within that color family. It still feels maybe a touch warm down here, but that could just be the photo. Let me know if it needs further tweaking. So let's jump right in, unless you have any specific questions before we get started. So the first thing that I'm noticing, I think, would be to push the contrast for your shadow. And again, looking at this picture, yeah, I think you could still probably push the contrast a little bit. Her shadow is a little on the cooler side as well in this particular photo. Because she's turning away from the light, her shadow is picking up a reflection of that background. So when we're thinking about our color selection, yes, she's under a cool light source. So normally her shadow would be considered warmer, right? So that's true. But the background here is reflecting into the shadow as well and influencing that color, and also influencing all of the forms as they wrap away from the light source. So it's actually picking up a little more of a neutral. Yeah, and it could just be that reflected light is a little bit on the warm side. So let's just take a sample of that for the paint over. And yeah, it's just a cooler brown, and I think probably a little bit on the darker side. Obviously the reflected light, but I'm going to take the average shadow. So yours is a little bit on the more yellow-red side, which is very similar to her average skin tone, which I actually think you captured pretty well. So if I grab something that feels like her average skin tone, like right in here, and then I grab something of similar value, like her average skin tone on here is also kind of found in these areas. I'm looking around for different spots because there's a lot of shift, and her highlights are a little more spread out in this angle. So it's something like right around there as well. I can see you have a little more pink there. It could be a little bit on the light side for her average skin tone. It seems really close though. I even almost see it down in here. But let me pull. Seems a little light for the forehead. I think I'm going to pull like right in here. So you can see yours is very, very close, but maybe a little bit on the hot side. A small touch of blue would change that right away. And looking, you do have some really nice cool tones in here though. Like the color you have in here is really, really nice. It's almost perfect. You have that purple. You even punched up the pink in here, which I would have done too. You have the cool violets in the lips. You have the nice cool tone under here. I think hers is maybe a little bit more on the violet spectrum, and yours is going maybe a little bit more on the green, yellow spectrum. But I think the biggest difference is going to be that shadow. Let me make some notes here really quickly before I move forward. So I'm going to make that background a little bit of a darker gray. Okay, so here we have our shadow. So you just probably want to add, I would say add ultramarine blue. And if that goes too cool, maybe a little bit of like red oxide or something like transparent red-orange. That would probably do the trick. And I did see your comment earlier on the forum, Susan, about listing the brands. Off the top of my head, I can list a few of them, but some other ones I might have to double check which brand I'm using for each color. But I'll try and list that today after the critique. So this color here, where did I take that one from? Oh, I took that. Did I take that under here? Yeah. So that was the undertone here. So that one, you want to go just a little bit more into the violet spectrum. So I would say adding a little ultramarine blue and maybe alizarin. That's for this area here. And then average skin tone. It just needs a little bit of ultramarine blue. And this is something I find quite often when I'm making skin tones, is that sometimes it needs just the smallest touch of blue to desaturate a little bit. It's really easy to overdo it, but it helps to kind of bring it more into a natural kind of range. But also, let's look at the highlight color, because I think yours could be probably a little bit on the cooler side. Yours might be a little bit on the peachy warm side, and she does have some of that around the highlight area. But I think if we cooled off that highlight, it would help her skin tones kind of feel more vibrant. Your value is really close. So it's just a matter of going a little bit more a little cooler pink. So I would say more of an alizarin in white rather than kind of a cad red, yellow ochre, white. That's almost what this feels like, which has more of a peachy tone. So do you have any questions about that so far? I was going to do a quick little paint over for you. So I think the biggest change is going to be that shadow. So if we go in and you just kind of glazed that shadow down a little bit, that would probably help quite a bit. And especially under here, it goes quite dark, even darker. And cooler. And you might find yourself needing to push that hair more into like a true black. If you can't mix it, you're always welcome to pull out like a black pigment. You didn't realize until the next day that you made the highlight on her head look like it's a bump. Oh, I see. You know what I think? I'll address that, but it's this value right here next to it. It should be, she does get darker there, but it should be a little bit lighter, and that will help it not feel like a bump. So I'll do that in the paint over. And sometimes, you know, when we're painting, we don't see these things. I come into my paintings the next day all the time. Look at it and I go, why did I do that? I didn't realize, you know, something was looking a certain way. One thing that'll help, and this is something we all need to remind ourselves of, and I try to consciously remind myself of, is to step back from your painting frequently. And sometimes, you know, we get so involved in our painting, we just like stay there at the easel, and before you know it, 3 hours has passed by and you haven't stepped back. So you can set a timer for yourself if you think that will help. You know, I'd say every 15 to 20 minutes, at least every half hour, take a break. Step back from your painting, look at it from across the room. And I could use this advice myself because I get so involved especially when I'm, filming for the class. I'm trying not to break it up too much, and also just work somewhat quickly so you guys don't have too many hours of video to watch. But it's a challenge because it's hard to see what you're doing until you step back. And those kind of things often pop out to you when you step back. Another trick I'll use is to take a hand mirror and look at the painting in reverse. So I'll turn my back to the painting, step 5-10 feet away, and look at the painting in the mirror, and these things will stand out to you. So like if the eyes feel off, a drawing error, or something like jumping in value and creating something that looks like a superficial bump on her head, that would have jumped out to you probably in a mirror. So those kind of things can help. It's just we have to be more conscious and remind ourselves to do that. It's very easy to just let the hours fly by. Okay, so let's get back to that shadow. So if we push that value even darker in a few areas, especially along that core shadow, comes in here, and then just remember that eye socket, she does have a little light spilling over, but that shadow wraps around that other side even though we can't see it. So it just helps to be conscious of that as well, because it's going to give you more volume. Her cast shadow, as a result, is also going to be a little bit on the darker side. And then in the lips is the only area where it gets even darker. There's just a little bit more of an accent there. So just now pushing that value darker, you can see how it really changed the feeling of her average skin tone. So just looking at that, it's that value relationship. So looking at the next area, let's see, her average skin tone is pretty good. So I think the only other area, let me adjust that bump in her forehead for you. So I think your color is probably a little hot too, and that's probably contributing to it popping out so much. So just taking and softening around that highlight just a little bit. And her highlight does it's more of a broken highlight on the forehead for this angle. There's a few reasons for that. So I'll talk about that really quickly for everyone. The highlights, depending on how sharp they feel, it really depends on where it sits on the face too. So if the highlight is sitting over an area that's bony or the skin is stretched really taut, a great example would be the nose or the center ball of the forehead right in here. If the highlight happens to hit that area, it's going to have a little bit of a sharper edge. On older skin, it starts to soften and be more broken because the skin is a little bit looser. On younger skin, it can be a little bit more taut, and also depends on the person's kind of natural skin texture. So here we do have that reflected highlight, but compared to the highlight color or the way the highlight behaves on the photo reference I used, we had much more of a sharp highlight, very distinct, and this one is much more diffused and soft. That also is influenced by how close the light source is to the model. If it's further away, or if they're turning away from the light, then it's going to be a little more diffused and soft. If it's much closer to them, it's more high contrast and a little bit more sharp. You'll notice like her highlight feels a little bit sharper right here over the bony mass, but then when it gets down into the softer tissue of the cheek, it starts to kind of break up and be a little more diffused. Also, the further from the light source the highlight sits, the less sharp it is. Like down in here in the chin, it's much softer. Even on her nose here, typically the highlight is much sharper, but the tightest part of the nose is usually right here, or if she was turned towards the light more, we might end up with a sharper highlight. She does get a sharper highlight right in here, because that's kind of where the bone from the opening to the nose cavity, the skeleton comes to the surface. So you want to think about these things. Same thing with the brow bone here. It's a much sharper highlight towards the top there. And those things can all contribute to the edges that and how we treat the highlights. It's the same kind of concept when you're looking at painting a still life. You might have an object that has a shiny surface and an object that has a softer, more matte surface, and those highlights are going to diffuse or be more crisp depending on the type of surface that you're painting, and the skin is very similar. So if we went in and cooled off a little bit of her highlights in here, made them kind of more of a purpley color or a cool pink, your placement of the highlights seems pretty good. But if we just cooled those off a little bit, I think it would help to kind of get her skin tone to glow just a little bit more. Color in the lips looks pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think it's going to be mostly that shadow. Again, watch this brow ridge here. It's a little bit cooler and darker on her because it's moving away from us. So it's going to kind of push a little bit darker. And same thing with this far side of the forehead where it meets the hair. If you kind of push it a little bit darker, maybe even carry some of that shadow color up to the edge a little bit on that side and let it be a little more diffused, I think that would help too. You do have some of those nice cool tones in the skin. The only one I would say make a little more violet would be maybe this one under here. And don't be afraid to carry some of that around this side of the chin, because again, that background color is starting to influence that a little bit. And then she has maybe just a little bit of a cooler tone. That might be a little heavy. Maybe cool off this color in here so it's not so yellow, but it's on the lighter side. I think that would help as well. Get it to turn under. Do you have any questions? And of course you would carry some of these cool tones down in through the chest and neck as well, but if you went back into it. Yeah, it's always surprising, no matter how warm her skin tones feel, how many cool tones are in there to kind of balance it out. I think even the color you have in here could be kind of utilized a little bit more to kind of soften that feeling of that bump in her forehead. Where we get a lot of those green tones is down in here, which I think you captured. You would just want to maybe sculpt a little bit of the form in the neck a little bit more right in here. The cast shadow creates a little bit of a confusing shape in here. How I would handle that is probably just pull her hair forward a little bit and then maybe take just a little bit of a cast shadow and soften it and just treat it really soft and kind of generalize it. I wouldn't go into all these little shapes in here because it kind of creates a confusing edge there. So I would just simplify that a little bit. And then she does have that kind of cooler violet highlights, which you could scumble in to these areas here and it would balance out that warmth in the lower body. Really nice work though. Good job. I know this was a challenging one. Well, they've all been challenging, I'm sure, in their own right. Colin, I think I saw you in here earlier. Go ahead and let me know if the value and the color looks pretty good to you. I'm going to go ahead and grab the sampler. All right, so yeah, really nice job. I actually almost painted this angle too. I had a hard time choosing. It's a really nice picture of her. Okay, so I think you had kind of mentioned that it felt a little bit on the light side. And I think for the most part, your shadow value seems okay. Looks a little sunk in here, so it's a little hard for me to tell exactly what the color is. But I see something close to that, and you might just be a little bit on the light side. But if it's sunk in and it's drying a little bit lighter, that's probably what's happening. So just take a look at your painting, and if you decide to go back in and rework it. What I do think is that her halftones here could probably be a little bit on the darker side. So there we have that one. And like in here we have, kind of depends on where I'm looking, because I feel like you do have a darker one here. So like with the color you have here transitioning out of the shadow seems pretty close in value. But down in the lower chin area, it could be a little bit darker. Oh yeah, so it did sink in a little bit. So what I would do, if you're going to go back in and rework it, Colin, oil it out and then take my suggestions and kind of see if, you know, they seem like they're a little bit on the dark side, or if you think you do need to make the corrections or not. All right, Susan, thanks for tuning in. Have a good weekend. Okay, so the same thing I think here in the forehead. Probably could use a little bit more dark. I think actually it's just that the shadow maybe carries over a little bit further, but let me take a sample here. Like right in there. That seems really close to that color. And yours might just be a hint darker or lighter. It's really, really close though. I think you captured her average tonality really well. Areas I would probably emphasize would maybe be some of the cooler, rich pinks in the cheek, or I mean in the lips. So we have that one there, and you're pretty close, but maybe a little bit on the pale side. So I would just go a little darker and more chromatic for a few areas, and you could even just glaze her lip with a little bit of a pink, and that might do make the adjustment enough. And then watch some of the contrast. While there is a high contrast between this value and the highlight, I think yours might be a little bit on the dark side. So hers is a little bit more opaque. And yours is a little bit more on the dark side. Let me make some notes here for you. So this is from this area here. And so you want to go from there to there. I would just say adding white should do the trick, and you'll get the color that you need. This is from the lip here. And you just want to go a little bit darker. So more alizarin probably will get you that color, or even a glaze if you wanted to just glaze over it and push that color a little bit further. The highlight color maybe could be a little bit more of a cool pink. So here's an example of another angle that I had photographed her where that center bone of the forehead makes more of a sharp highlight. And you can see it's quite light, but she doesn't end up with that same intensity of highlight really anywhere else except for the tip of the nose, and even there it's a little bit on the darker side. Everywhere else is pretty diffused. So yours is just a little bit more on the yellow side, so push that more towards the pink. So I'll just point that out, that that's the highlight color, and you want to go that direction. You could even just add white to that color, and you'd probably, and maybe a little bit of alizarin, and that would probably you use titanium white for the highlight. You know, I find that titanium white is so opaque that sometimes it does lack that kind of vibrancy. You could try using a lead white if you're open to using a lead white. Another way to try and get around that is to use like a warm, I think there's a couple of companies out there that make something called a warm titanium white. And you can try even making your own just by warming it up. But we don't want it to go too yellow. And that's probably, maybe that's what you were trying to fight, was how cold and dull it felt. You could try just taking that color and lightening it a little bit, and then throw in like a color that has some vibrancy to it, like an alizarin. And it will have that coolness to it, but at least it'll have a little bit more of a vibrancy, if that makes sense. There's a reason I don't tend to use titanium white, and I find the same thing, that it tends to make skin tones wash out too quickly. Also, it's going to fight you when you paint someone with darker skin, because it has a tendency to, a very small amount of titanium white will really wash out the color. So those are some things you can try to play with and see. One thing you could do is take a titanium white, add a very small amount of yellow ochre, and then throw in that alizarin, and see if that gives you that. But try your warm white if you have one. Okay, so I'm going to just do a quick paint over here. Okay, so I think the main one here is that forehead here on the left side. If we just went a little bit lighter and cooler, and then that highlight color, you could even leave that, Colin, leave that warm color kind of haloing around the highlight, that yellow, and then when you place that cooler highlight in the middle, it'll vibrate off the yellow and not kind of feel like it just suddenly goes really, really cool. So, for example, brighten up that left side, and then you have this yellow highlight there, and then you go in with your cool highlight and just hit kind of the center of that highlight and leave some of that warmth around it, and that's another way to kind of get that similar effect. So you can even take your warmer highlight and push it over to the left as well, as a way to transition to this other color here. The next area would be pushing those halftones a little bit darker in this area down here. It's not going to take too much, but you can see kind of it'll turn that form a little more gradually, especially down in this jaw area. She has quite a bit of it. And down in the chin. And And I'm just going to simplify your shadow here. I know yours is sunk in, so you might need to just take a look at that once it's oiled out and decide if you want to make it a little bit darker. You might, I don't think you'll need to, just because of the way the sinking in feels. And then the only other thing I think is up here, the shadow kind of wraps the forehead a little bit, and her hair probably could come forward just to make her forehead not feel so wide there at the top. So just take some of your hair color there and just pull that forward. And that value right next to the hairline up in here is really, really close. So it just kind of fades off into her hair. Her forehead might be a little high. I don't usually go into some of the drawing things, but going in with a cooler color right where the hairline is can help to turn that form a little sooner too. You can see what a difference that made though, just pushing that value down in that lower jaw a little bit more. Yeah, you know, and that's actually something, so you said this stage helped you understand the shortcomings of the previous portrait. That's kind of why I had us start with fair, and then we went to medium, and then we went to dark. And you guys can rewatch these videos and, you know, attempt one of the other angled portraits just to get used to that kind of progression. And, you know, it just, especially if you're not used to painting like one of the skin tones. And, you know, there's huge variety within dark skin tone or medium skin tone. There's huge variety. So, you know, even within that, there's a lot of different models you can work with on your own to kind of apply some of these principles to. So in the lip, like I said, the only thing I would say is just don't be afraid to kind of push that. And probably her upper lip, you're really close, but you could probably just push this side, the one moving away from the light, a little bit darker, and that's going to give you a little more dimension. And don't be afraid to go in nice and dark where that underplane. In fact, I like the color you used here a little better. So you can keep it on the warm side or something very close to your dark shadow. But that's going to keep that plane turning. And she has a little more of that in here. And that's pretty much it. Also, just maybe raise her brow ridge a little higher, like her eyebrow is going to arc up a little bit more and give you a little more space. I'll just kind of sketch in where it is. A little more space around this area here in this brow ridge. The other side is fine. I think just that right side got a little bit low. So your question is, in general, would you light a dark skin model different from, say, the second model? Not really. I think it, you know, you can put them under, as you'll see, like in our new photo references, I don't know if you've taken a look at them, but some of them I kind of included the same type of lighting situation or a very similar one. You're just going to get different effects because, you know, lighter skin's going to reflect the color slightly different, especially like within the darker side of the skin, like or the shadow side. But not necessarily. I wouldn't light it any differently. I usually, when I'm working with a model, I just play around with the light until I see a shape that I think is interesting. I'll have them turn their head or tilt their head a little bit different and get a feel for maybe, you know, how that light's reacting. Sometimes I will play with the temperature because some, you know, lighting might not be the most flattering. But generally speaking, you can work with any type of light on your model. It's just going to give you different effects. It might bring out Like a warmer light might have brought out the yellow in her skin more, whereas the cool light is emphasizing some of those cooler kind of violets that she had in her skin as well. So it kind of depends on what kind of mood you want in your piece. And that's something we talk about in the coming week, is using light to create mood. So having a warm lit portrait versus a cool lit portrait is going to have two different feelings to them. Really nice work though. Do you have any questions? And I don't know if any of you peeked at our photo references, but we're going to be kind of turning our whole concept of what we think skin tones are kind of upside down. It's going to be a pretty good challenge. I think it was challenging even for me to look at such intense colors. I don't remember if anyone in here was colorblind. I remember I've had some students in the past say that they were colorblind, red-green colorblind. If these photo references, my husband's colorblind, so this is why I'm bringing it up. If any of you are colorblind and some of the references are really hard for you to see, especially the ones that are kind of red-green, you might consider using the one that's more yellow-blue. So for example, I have a male model in there where he has more of a yellow light on him and a blue shadow. Do that one because it's going to be a little bit easier for you to see. Your eyes are going to be able to adjust to the yellow-blue rather than the red-green. So just keep that in mind if you know that you're colorblind. I'm only bringing that up because I've had students in the past say, I'm colorblind, how do I address, go about mixing my palette? There are some really famous artists who are colorblind. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Julio Reyes, but he is colorblind. And red-green, which is the most common for men, is red-green colorblind. And so he orients his palette, you'll notice, around yellows and blues. And that's because it's easier for him to see those colors. So just keep that in mind if that's a challenge that you're facing. Oh, Jenny, how did I photograph with the blue lights? I am going to do a video for week 6. I'm going to do like a little bonus video for everyone on how to set up and do a color gel lighting. So basically, if you go, and I'll post this in the forum today, so if you guys want to try it out, you have time to order the supplies. But I just ordered what are called color gels on Amazon. I think I paid like $12 for a whole set of like 10 different colors. And they're like these transparent films, almost like what do you call it? Like a clear plastic, but it has a tint to it. And then you just clip that in front of your light. Just to be clear though, sometimes if you put them next to a hot light, they will kind of get wavy and melt. So make sure you're using like a cool touch light, like a CFL. They don't get very hot, or an LED light. They don't get very hot either, or at all. So putting that in front of there, you won't have the rippling that can happen with the plastic getting hot from the bulb. So how I photograph them is I use the color gels in front of a light bulb. But I'm going to do a little video tutorial, bonus video for next week on how to set up with a model. I'm just going to use my Asaro head, but I'm going to show you how you can go around and play with more theatrical lighting like what we're going to be working with. Do you have any other questions? Oh, and Jenny, another thing is if you don't want to order the color gels, you can buy colored light bulbs, and they work just as well. You can find those in like a normal hardware store. They usually have like a little section where you can find the different colored light bulbs. So you can buy red, yellow, and blue. They might even have a green. And I used to use those when I taught color theory for still life, or just like a general color theory class. Because we'd set up like a white object, in a shadow box, and then we'd put like a colored bulb on it. And it was just easier to do that. So you can also buy those and use those instead. I do find that the color gels, some are better than others. So the ones I used for the class, I'll link those in our forum so you guys can order them if you would like to try it out. All right, so let's go ahead and go with our last review. So Jenny, are you, oh, there you are. Sorry. All right, so how does your picture look, Jenny? Just let me know if it needs any tweaking. I think it looks pretty close. I realize there's a little bit of glare here, but you know, they're really fun to experiment. So I would order some, or just get some of the colored bulbs. I'll see if I can find some of those on Amazon too. Are you in the UK or are you in the US? Because that can change which Amazon link I provide. But I can look up and see if I can find the UK one if you're over there. But yeah, basically, I encourage you to experiment with it. It's a great way to teach yourself color theory. Like, that's why I provided those references of the Asaro head in the very beginning. Those are great to also practice with. Practice painting an Asaro head with that light on it. But you can do it for still life too. Oh, you're in the UK. Okay, so I'll try and provide a link for each one if I can. And if they have it available to you over there. But you should be able to find them. And even if you have like a local photography store where like professionals can go, they should have color gels. So that's another option too, if you have like a local photography shop that you can go to. They're less common now, but like if, you know, here we have like there's a couple of like tech stores that have a photography section, or we have B&H Photo. So you can always order from those places as well. They're used a lot in film and cinematography and that sort of thing too. Okay, so how does your picture look here? Does it look pretty good? Do you want me to make any adjustments to it before we get started? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I just saw that you said it looks okay. All right. Okay, so I can tell that this is kind of glare, so I can't quite do a color sample there, but it looks like your average shadow tone is pretty good. That looks like it right there. You might be able to go a little bit darker. Yeah, I'm not too worried about the chest area, so don't worry about that. I'm going to concentrate on the face. So what I would say, your shadow looks pretty good. Maybe you need more of a core shadow right here just to push that contrast with that edge. And then the half tone here could probably be maybe a little bit darker. So that's hers. And then yours looks like right there. So maybe we could push that a little bit darker, and that's going to help give you a little bit more turn to that form. I do see that you have more of that up here. So that might just be a little bit on the cooler side. She definitely has more of a warm tone up in her forehead because I think it's just because she gets maybe a little more sun up there. And then looking at the highlight color, it could probably be a little bit cooler pink. Same thing with everyone else. In the forehead, you might be okay, but I think down in here, you might want to push that color a little bit more. So let me make a few notes here for you. So you want to go from here to here. You probably are going to just add a little bit more dark. You could even glaze it, like I mentioned to a few others earlier, with the trans oxide red and ultramarine blue. Sometimes just doing a transparent glaze to that area can deepen it just the right amount. Here, this is that, so this is the shadow. And here we have transition mid-tone. And we just want to go, so I think this was the forehead, and this was the cheek. We just want to go more into this kind of rusty brown color. So you could, I think you could actually do something very similar and just add a little bit of transoxide or maybe burnt sienna. And a little bit of ultramarine blue if it goes too hot of a color. Excuse me. And then this is the highlight. I feel like you have her average skin tone pretty close, so it'll be just mostly an introduction of these halftones. I do like the kind of cool violet you have here, but we might want to push that value a little bit darker. So for that highlight tone, we're gonna go this direction and just introduce some alizarin, white, and maybe a little bit of blue. Look on your color chart. You might be able to find something that's going to give you close to that color. Okay, so let me look at a couple of other areas. Other than down here needing to be a little bit darker, maybe a little cooler right in here. It gets a little bit more of like a grayish color. So that's more in that transition to the keystone shape, and yours is just a little bit on the warmer side, so that would just be a matter of adding some blue to that color. So I'm just going to point out that is where that is. Get my layers here in order. Okay, so that's that color there. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to do a quick paint over. Do you have any questions? So if we took that kind of coarse shadow and just, I know this is glare, so if you oil it out and it's already this dark, you don't need to repaint it. But I think the main thing is getting that transition a little bit on the darker side. And I think same thing up here in the forehead. Don't be afraid to push that a little warmer and darker. That looks pretty good already. So you can see the difference that adding that additional half tone in that transition area has helped. And then the highlight, well, let me cool off that keystone shape here a little bit. It's almost the color you have up here in that forehead on the left side. And going maybe a touch darker just down in here. And maybe right that purple you had right there on the chin. Don't be afraid to push that. Even that one goes maybe a little bit more into this darker realm before it meets that shadow. And the highlight would be the final adjustment. I think it's a matter of just going in. Your highlight on the forehead is plenty bright, but maybe going in and adding, I would even maybe push the value a little bit more for a few of those areas, just to help balance out some of that warm that you have, because I think you have plenty of the warm color in her skin tone there. And she has like that really kind of bluish color up here in her eye socket that can help to create more interest and variety there. And then I think on her lip, maybe a little bit on the darker side down towards the bottom plane. So right where that turns, so the highlight's hitting kind of the furthest point out on the lip, and then it changes planes and turns under. So you might consider pushing that value a little bit darker. And maybe even this plane here, because it's turning away from the light. She gets a little bit of light up here as it transitions into the cheek, but it can help to get that feeling of the muzzle kind of rounding out. Also, when we put really chromatic colors down in here, it's going to get those forms to jump forward. Those are more appropriate colors for up here, but down in here you can see she gets kind of more neutral. So I would go a little darker and just pull more cool tones. You almost had the color actually right here already, and that's just going to gradate up, and pretty soon it gets to be more of her kind of warmer average flesh tone. So you can see how that already started to turn. And if you look right on that edge where that form disappears, you can see how it gets even darker and it picks up some of that background color. So when we're talking about creating softer edges that turn towards the background, sometimes just going in with a tile of a color somewhat between the flesh tone and that background color. You could even probably use like the color you use in here. It creates that form, it rounds it down a little bit and creates a natural soft edge and gives a little more dimension to the portrait. But really nice job. Do you have any questions? All right, so let's see, I think that's everyone. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. If anyone has any general questions that they'd like to ask, just go ahead and type it in the chat box. And if not, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. So I'm going to make a note for myself here to post the color gels link. So look for that in the forum. You guys will get an email notification when I post that. And then Susan had asked about my brands for each color. And I'll try to remember exactly which ones. For the most part, I think I know off the top of my head, but they can vary depending on which color I'm using. All right, guys, it doesn't look like anyone has any questions, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I hope you guys enjoy the new lesson this week and the unique challenge it's going to present. If you guys have any questions or you want to work on your own painting or your own portrait, try and get those images to me by Monday so that I can let you know if it's going to work well or not. The main key that you want to look for when you're deciding on a photo reference is you want to avoid distortion from the camera. So make sure you take your photo from at least maybe 5 foot back from the model and then use a zoom lens. You want to make sure that you can see enough detail, and you also want to make sure that you have kind of a directional light. Sorry, my dogs are barking. So a directional light. So you want to make sure, set your model next to a window, or if you want to use the color gels, you can just buy a regular light bulb and point it at your model. Sometimes you can, at the hardware store, you can buy those like dome lights that are just like clamp on, and they're really inexpensive. And those work great for lighting models too. So you don't need fancy equipment. You could just use, pretty simple. Okay. All right, guys. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Have a good weekend.